Okay, hi. So today we're going to talk about the basics of the American presidency. Once again, it is me, your professor, Dr. Selby. Oops, here we go. Oh, there we go. So I want to start with just a very simple comparative lesson looking at comparative democratic executives around the world. Not all democratic governments have presidents. Some have prime ministers, okay? Britain is an example here. The difference is that a president is independently elected and separate from the legislative body, whereas a prime minister is the leader of the largest party in parliament. He's actually elected to sit in parliament, which is their version of Congress, and he sits in the parliament, okay? So, and he's beholden to the parliament. They can kick him out if they get mad at him and replace him with a new prime minister. Okay. So basically, in a parliamentary system of governance like Britain, Spain, and Germany, the prime minister is both the executive and a legislator. And some countries like France and India, they have both presidents and prime ministers. We call that a semi-presidential system. In India, the president's more of just a figurehead, doesn't really have that much power. In France, the president actually has quite a bit of power and kind of resides, they call it cohabitation, if the president and prime minister are of different parties. You know, it's kind of informally, they kind of had to work out who gets to do what between the president and the prime minister in France. If the president and prime minister are of the same party, then the president is considered to be more important than the prime minister. Okay, so let's just look at a bit of history here. Where did our founding fathers get the basic model for the president that they put together? Well, they got it mostly from the British king. That was what they were familiar with. But British kingship, especially at the time that our founding fathers were familiar with, was surrounded by representative institutions that were almost democratic. They weren't quite what we would today call democratic, but they were well on their way there. Britain was ahead of the rest of Europe in getting to democratic institutions. And so the model they had was the British king, who worked very closely with Parliament. He wasn't allowed to do laws without Parliament's consent. He had a veto power. He had a very similar set of powers that the American president had. Okay, and in many ways, the American president is basically an elected monarch. The powers he has are strongly derived from that of the British monarchy. He's not quite as powerful as the British king at the time. So the British king had a little more power. They jiggered things around a little bit. But very strongly rooted in their experience with the British system of governance. So there's two big differences between the American president and the British president. Those two big differences are that the president doesn't call Parliament to order. The Congress calls themselves to order, and they do whatever they want on that front. That power was used by British kings frequently too. They just refused to call Parliament, and then they just go around doing whatever they want, and then Parliament has to sit around and wait for the king to call them back, right? So they did that in order to increase the power of Congress vis-a-vis the president. And then similarly, second, they gave the power to declare war to the House of Representatives, and they split the treaty-making power between the president and the Senate. So they strongly reduced the president's power on that function as well. This is a goofy little painting. There you go, give you guys. Lansdowne Portrait by Gilbert Stuart. This is George Washington. He was our first president in his stateroom. We don't paint him like this anymore, do we? His arm is open, sort of leading to the future almost. Like, look, here, guiding future American democracy to the future, right? wearing his black robe, very regal, very stately, like, prim and proper, standing up straight. You have the quill and pen behind him, so it's kind of some official type stuff. The red cloth, the table, a little American flag, a chair with kind of almost like an American flag thing in the back there. But like, let's compare it to some European portraits from the time, right? James II, who was the Catholic King of England, and was deposed in the Glorious Revolution, 1688. I picked this one. It's a little bit from before our time period, but portraiture hadn't changed that much in Europe in the 100 years in between, because the Glorious Revolution was actually the moment where British Parliament became more powerful and more important than the king, and that was the change in British politics that then led our founding fathers to want to model our system of governments off the British one, right? So from 1688 to today, British politics has been representative, okay, strongly representative, and Parliament from 1688 increased its power, okay. Also coming out of the Glorious Revolution, we're not going to talk about too much, but they kicked out this king and they brought in a different king because they were mad at this one, right? He was Catholic. They don't like Catholics. He was trying to govern without Parliament, things like that. It also led to a Bill of Rights. So the Magna Carta is this early moment, way early moment, 12-something, in British constitutional history. The Bill of Rights is very similar to the Magna Carta. It stipulates limits to what the president can, what the king can do. Okay, so our Bill of Rights, their Bill of Rights, right? So there's some interesting lots of interesting parallels here. In this video, we're only going to talk about the first 5 of these powers. These are more of the smaller powers, and then I have later videos for talking about executive order and also emergency powers. Okay. But this is the list of things the president gets to do. He's chief executive, he's head of state, he has appointment, he gets to pardon people, and he has veto power. Let's talk about the difference between chief executive and head of state. Chief executive is really the business title. That's what most of the president's jobs are doing. When he's hiring and firing people, running the government, that's all chief executive stuff. Head of state is the ceremonial title, okay? Hosting state dinner. So, most of what the president does under chief executive falls under chief executive. So most of what he does is the executive stuff, but hosting state dinners, cutting ribbons, pardoning turkeys, those are all part of the head of state role. As chief executive, he's commander-in-chief, educator-in-chief, treasury officer-in-chief, taxman-in-chief. He's all those things in chief. When he negotiates treaties, he's a chief executive. When he hosts a state dinner, he's head of state. In England, just real quick, in England, in many foreign countries, these are actually separated. So in England, the chief executive is the prime minister, but the head of state is still the queen. And the queen is in charge of all of those ceremonial type things, and the prime minister does the chief executive. In India, the president is the head of state. He does the ceremonial stuff. He has very little to do with the day-to-day operation of the government, but the prime minister does the chief executive stuff. Okay, so that's the first 2 done. The president gets to appoint judges, including Supreme Court justices. He gets to appoint the heads of federal agencies and members of commissions. Collectively, these are known as all the heads of the federal agencies and some of the heads of the commissions are known as his cabinet, because when he seeks to ask a question, he opens the doors of the cabinet and they're sitting in neat little rows, are all of his advisors, and he says, Treasury Secretary, this secretary, that secretary, answer me these questions. And so they serve to advise him. So it's like, you open the cabinet, what do you keep in the cabinet? You keep important things you can consult. I need to know something from the Secretary of Education. I need to know something from the Secretary of State. Please tell me this. He has a question. And their function there is to advise him. the king had ministers, right, that advised him as well. It comes from this very similar logic. And then he also gets to appoint ambassadors. All of these appointments the president picks, but they're confirmed by the Senate, advise and consent. The Senate has to agree, and they are sometimes turned down. Not terribly recently, but again, there's been the recent shift in from filibuster to non-filibuster. So now you used to be able to filibuster these things. You cannot filibuster them anymore. One of the probably more enjoyable things the president gets to do is pardon people, let them out of jail free, right? It's like Monopoly. You pull the card, get out of jail free. Woohoo, I'm out of here. There's a lesser form of a pardon called a commutation. A pardon is the crime comes off the books. You've been pardoned. You don't even have to put it on a job resume anymore, okay? A commutation is different. A commutation reduces the penalty but doesn't take the crime off your record, okay? It's just a smaller version of pardon, right? It's like a partial pardon. Frequently, a commutation takes the form of time served. You have 10 years left on your sentence. I'm canceling that 10 years. I'm leaving you with the thing on your record. You've already served 10 years. That's good enough. Go home, okay? Famous pardons through history. Gerald Ford, who took over after Nixon Nixon resigned. He would have been impeached. Ford pardoned Nixon, and Nixon hadn't even been brought up on any charges yet. Ford just said, look, blanket pardon to Nixon for any crimes that he might have committed in the Watergate scandal. I'm just saying, you're not going to be prosecuted for it. There have been group pardons in history, which is kind of interesting. Andrew Johnson, who was president right after Lincoln, pardoned all the soldiers of the Confederate Army, just all at once. I mean, they had taken up arms against the government. Technically, that's treason. Technically, you could shoot them all. No one was going to do that. But, treason is punishable with death. It's it's a very reasonable punishment for treason, actually. But he just said, look, no one was going to do that. But you could have done a fine to each soldier or, something like that. And Johnson just said, no, it's similar logic to why Ford pardoned Nixon. The country needs to heal. The best way to do this is to end the discussion, give people a break, hopefully that can help kind of bring the North and South together. And then more recently, Barack Obama didn't do it the same way Andrew Johnson did it, which was just hey, everyone's pardoned. Barack Obama did a whole bunch of individual pardons, but it amounted to almost 2,000 nonviolent drug offenders. They weren't pardoned. He commuted their sentences. Okay. So he basically said, okay, time served, go home, but you did do the crime. You were caught, you were punished. Okay. But his logic was a lot of the sentences that were given to them, he thought were excessive. And so he said, look, these are excessive sentences for nonviolent drug crimes. I'm commuting your sentence. In that case, it's mostly time served. Another word for commutation is clemency. Clemency means sort of forgiveness. Commute means to reduce. Let's talk about the next power, the power of veto. This guy is Vito Genovese. He's a mobster. He was an enforcer for the mafia. But Vito is not just an Italian guy in a suit. See, I got this from Wikipedia, but they always have these nice fancy suits that they were wearing, right? Veto is the president's power to say no to a law that he does not like. Okay. But much like Vito Genovese, the president's power is not so much in using the veto, it's more in threatening to use the veto. The veto threat, okay? So we don't see presidents have a ton of vetoes. If you look at the reading on this, Reagan actually used the veto power relatively heavily. and then was overridden a number of times as well. But the real power of the veto is the power of the threat, the veto threat, okay? Basically, if something's coming through Congress the president doesn't like, he issues a veto threat, and he goes to the people in Congress. He says, I will veto this unless you change this, that, and the other thing, okay? And, listen, that they want laws to be passed, right? He's part of the process, so they're going to listen to him on this most of the time. And, usually they'll come to a compromise here, right? Not always, but usually. Especially if both parties of Congress are held by an opposition party. So if House of Reps and Senate are one and the president is the other, and that's just how it is, then the House and the Senate will pass a decent amount of things, put it on his desk, and they'll say, look, we dare you to veto this. This is popular for our constituents. We want them to know that we're doing everything we can to get this law passed. And if you have a problem with it, you need to veto it, and you need to go on the record basically as not supporting this issue. Okay. The veto is not the only tool a president has to bargain with Congress, however. Okay. And a lot of the president's day nowadays is spent doing just that. I don't think the founding fathers conceived of this particular relationship, but it's not a big surprise that it evolved this way. The president largely sets the policy agenda for the country, and thereby also for Congress. In elections, president runs with different platforms. So, Trump had his platform, Clinton had his platform. We'll see what the platform for Biden is, okay? And whoever wins, also their presidential platform gains some legitimacy. And then, Congress thinks about that. Well, people voted for this. It kind of seems like they want it, right? And so when you win, it gives you some legitimacy for trying to enact those policy goals. We also call those policy goals the president's legislative program, right? And it's all public. This is on, you go whitehouse.gov and it's all there. Other things the president can do as far as trying to push his legislative program, he can try to work actively putting together legislative coalitions by directly lobbying legislators. That some presidents have more and less success than others. Generally speaking, presidents who came from Congress have a little bit of an easier time doing that because they have the personal relationships developed. They know the internal rules of Congress better, and they're familiar with the process of horse trading, log rolling, sausage making. And so they're a little more willing to sort of engage in those types of behaviors. LBJ was really good at this. Reagan was actually pretty good at that, and he hadn't come from Congress, but you don't have to come from Congress to be good at it. And Obama actually, he did okay on that. He had come from Congress, but he tended to take a little bit more of a back seat, and he wasn't as much of an active president out there trying to push legislative coalitions. He kind of let Congress do its thing, and then he would say, okay, sounds good, let's do it, and he would give input. I would like to see this, I would like to see that, but he wasn't really at the forefront of building legislative coalitions. Now, Congress definitely does not always listen to what the president wants, and in divided government, where you have, as long as one branch of government is not held by the president's party, either the House or the Senate, you're going to see them hold up significant issues of his legislative program. They might be able to find some agreements. They might not. There have been some things. Democrats have worked with Trump on certain things. If Democrats like it, they're more than willing to work with Trump. The coronavirus bill being a good example, which sailed through Congress, but it was also a great example of bargaining, not just between the president and Congress, but also between the House and the Senate, where the Senate had their bill. That was a Republican bill, a little more favorable to business. The Democrats in the House had their bill. It was a little more, let's give money to individuals, expand unemployment insurance, go sort of straight to the people. And elements of both of those bills ended up being in the final package. Both sides kind of had to water down what they wanted a little bit too. That's kind of an example of just huge log roll, horse trade, sausage make all at the same time. And, in the age of partisanship, extreme partisanship, the way we're seeing it, it's frequently more in a legislator's interest to try to fight against the administration if they're from a different party than to try to work with them. No one in California, some, but like not a lot of Democrats in California are really excited about working with Trump, right? If you come to California and you're Dianne Feinstein or Kamala Harris, you're like, yeah, I totally worked with Trump. You're like, what are you doing? We don't want that, right? So it's more in their electoral interest to actually fight with Trump and try to hold up his legislative program. Now, if a president is being held up by Congress, there are some other options he has. They're not that great. Mostly what presidents will try to do is what scholars have called going public. And in going public, what you do is you take your message straight to the American people. You hold press conferences, you hold rallies, you do TV shows, you do everything you can to try to mobilize a wave, groundswell of support on the grassroots, so to speak, to try to push legislators to do what you want them to do. The political science research here is quite clear, actually. This is not a particularly effective way to get what you want done. Occasionally it works, but usually what happens is presidents go to Congress, they try to bargain with Congress, it doesn't work. They say, ugh, bummer. And then they try going public and they usually fail, okay? So, just keep that in mind. The way you can move Congress is you help get new people elected who agree with you. And if you're a president who's able to do that, and you're able to bring along more people into your party and win some seats, that increases, your power in the Congress. So that's very helpful. And that shows that there is support out there for your legislative program, that people are responding to it. And then all legislators are because that electoral connection is now getting involved here. And they're like, oh, if I don't do this, there actually could be negative electoral consequences for me. So I'm going to think a little bit longer and harder about if I'm willing to support some policies from a president who's from a different party than I am. I have the site in the this is from the reading. Research has found that presidents' efforts to go public on behalf of their legislative program are only marginally successful, and then under only the most stringent conditions. It's hard to go public. If you're able to, so imagine a scenario maybe where even if Trump doesn't get a Republican majority in the House, but if somehow Republicans pick up a decent amount of House seats in this next cycle, and Democrats feel like, oh, the country's really supporting this, they feel a little bit on their heels, that might be kind of interesting to see how that all shakes out. I wouldn't expect that to happen. Trump's tried really hard in the Senate he goes and has supported a lot of Republican senators in various types of special elections and things, and he hasn't had a ton of success with that. If all the people Trump had supported were winning, then it would be really increasing his chances for passing his legislative program, but that doesn't seem to be what's happening. Now, right now, people are talking about maybe Democrats and Trump can find an agreement on some kind of infrastructure spending, right? That's a thing Democrats want. They might be willing to play ball with Trump on that. So it'll be interesting to see. So stay tuned to see how the coronavirus and all of that keeps going. Now, with that said, presidents do have a huge effect in the public, okay? Teddy Roosevelt called it a bully pulpit, and he was known for calling people into his office and, basically yelling at them. And the press, the press is going to report what the president does and says, even if they disagree. So the president has what we call a national audience. Everyone listens to the president. He is the only person who represents absolutely all of us. Very important, interesting, fact here. And so by talking directly to the people, presidents are still able to have a strong effect on public opinion and public agenda setting. It's just hard to mobilize all that power outside of an election to get your legislative priorities passed. Okay. So, it can happen, but, this, where they have the most power in doing this is if they're able to help their party win legislative elections. And that seems to me to be the key test here. Let's see. If traditional media is kind of not on your side, which was the case for FDR, the newspapers were very conservative. They didn't like a lot of the stuff he was doing. It's socialism, right? And so he was kind of getting smacked by the media. So he said to himself, well, I need a way to communicate directly to the American people and go around the media, okay? And he was able to do that using radio. And he just started talking directly to the American people. And every week he would have a fireside chat, is what he called it. And, he would talk directly to the American people. And this is through the depths of the Great Recession when things were really, really bad. And so, there you go. In a similar way, Trump was able to do that with his use of Twitter, right? Traditional media is giving him negative coverage. Even Fox News is kind of spinning maybe his stuff like a little bit, and being blocked from getting his message out. Trump was able to go straight to the American people. So, Trump's use of Twitter here finds an interesting historical analog with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Oh, and that's the end of this lecture. So this one's brief. It's not the most exciting lecture, but it's decent. And we'll call it quits here.